How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the TAPED podcast, the most iron podcast in the world. We're your hosts, as always, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome back to another edition of our Worst to Best series. You all know how this works by now. We rank the albums of a certain band or artist's entire discography, studio albums only normally. But today, we're going to be doing a Worst to Best on possibly one of the most, if not the most popular heavy metal band of all time. And of course, today we're going to be talking about UK heavy metal legends, Iron Maiden. And I've been very excited to do this one. We've planned this one for months, but since Iron Maiden released Senjutsu, we had to push it back by a month or two. But, now it's finally time to get this over and done with. So, you ready, dude?
Hold on, I thought we were doing a Kiss Worst to Best. Or am I?
Oh, God, no.
Oh God, I got the schedule mixed up. I guess I can do Iron Maiden.
Oh, shut up.
I guess that works.
Oh, Christ. So yeah, we're going to be covering every single Iron Maiden album. We're going to cover everything that they've done from their self-titled debut all the way up to their most recent album, Senjutsu. No live albums, no compilations or B-sides albums, just the normal studio stuff full of original material. And, yeah, I think we'll just get started. So we're going to start at the number 17 pick. In my opinion, Iron Maiden's worst album is Virtual 11.
And I agree.
Yes, the second and final album that the band have ever made with Blaze Bayley on vocals, and many people would often consider this album as one of, if not the worst Iron Maiden album, and I'm inclined to agree with them, since compared to the rest of their discography, Virtual 11 virtually has very little to offer in terms of quality. Now the album, it doesn't start off too bad actually with Futureal, which isn't an amazing song, but for what it's worth, it's actually okay. But from there on, the album just gets progressively worse, and it's just such a slog to sit through. The band do try to kind of recapture the same energy that they previously had with Bruce on vocals, but the instrumentals just don't have the same drive, great songwriting, and passion that those previous records have. Instead, we're just kind of left with the same, generic uninspired Iron Maiden instrumental after generic uninspired Iron Maiden instrumental. And at this point, it just gets very tiring, since the music itself just sounds bored as fuck, and therefore I'm bored as fuck. It's like someone took a computer AI and said, computer, make whatever Iron Maiden album you want, out of these many, words and, instrumentals as you can. And this would probably be the album that fucking pops out. It's just that non-essential. Mm-hmm. It literally just comes off like it was an absolute chore to make on the band's end, nor does it even feel like the record the band truly wanted to make. There's no passion. It almost sounds like they're on autopilot. Blaze Bayley isn't necessarily bad, but he just isn't doing a good job throughout this album, in my opinion. It just more so sounds like he's trying to emulate Bruce Dickinson, and arguably he just doesn't sound passionate on this thing. He sounded more passionate on the album that preceded it, but on here, he just sounds like he's just not doing anything interesting. He doesn't really fit Iron Maiden, in my opinion. Not to mention, the mixing on his vocals just feels kind of weird to me. It's like Blaze is almost blending into the instrumentals, and I don't like it. This album, it just feels like an obligation. There isn't much of anything on this album that I can enjoy, bar Futureal, but that's it really. It's just the biggest slog of an album that Iron Maiden have ever made, and for those reasons alone, I would consider Virtual 11 their worst album to date.
Well, yep, I definitely agree. This album is just an absolute slog to listen to. It's one of the two albums released during a 6-year period where Bruce Dickinson left the band and was replaced, as you said, by Blaze Bayley. And, this album, Virtual 11, really possesses none of the qualities I look for in an Iron Maiden project. The instrumentation is just sluggish, it's uneventful, and far too often it resorts to just the most cookie-cutter, just metal ideas imaginable. And Blaze Bayley just does not mesh with the band whatsoever, in my opinion. His vocals, on surface level are fine, but just as you said, it feels like he's trying very hard to fill a Bruce Dickinson shaped hole instead of, doing his own thing, and it just comes off as kind of awkward and just not good, let's be frank. On the previous album with Bayley, there was a little bit of cohesion when it comes to the instrumentation. There was just some more interesting things happening overall. But here, the cohesion that you could expect from the instrumentals just isn't there. The instrumentals sounds just as awkward as Blaze does. Everything about this project is just honestly downright bad. It has like maybe one or two good moments, and even those come solely from the instrumental work. Overall, it's definitely a low point for the band, and it does, as you said, feel like an obligation more than a passion project or anything like that.
Yeah. Alright, my favourite tracks from Virtual 11, well, it's just Future Real. And my least favourite tracks are The Angel and The Gambler.
My favourite track is The Clansman. My least favourite tracks are Future Real, Don't Look Into the Eyes of a Stranger, and Como Es Time, Amigo.
Okay, we're moving on to our number 16 pick, and I chose The X Factor.
I chose No Prayers for the Dying.
Alright, this album was one that saw Bruce Dickinson leave the band after partaking in 7 studio albums with Iron Maiden. He ended up pursuing a solo career thereafter, and in his place the band decided to hire Blaze Bayley, and they continued on with him for the 2 studio albums, and they're unfortunately they're both at the bottom of my list. These albums are particularly some of the most disliked in the band's discography, and we already talked about Virtual 11, so let's move on with The X Factor, which is just a kind of woeful and boring attempt from the band, really. And it's kind of a failed change-up in their sound, in my opinion. A lot of Iron Maiden fans seem to solely blame Blaze for, why these albums are the way they are, but that's just completely wrong to, put the entire blame on him, since the album, has other problems outside of that. For one, the X Factor is just boring, simply put. Instrumentally, the X Factor is sticking with the band's traditional sound, except it's bringing a more murky and kind of brooding sound to it. So on that merit, I would say the X Factor sounds like the darkest Iron Maiden album, but it's too bad it's being held back by out-to-do-nothing instrumentals. There's just so many cookie-cutter, uninspired and bland instrumentals, especially for Iron Maiden standards. And in the case of Blaze Bayley, I was absolutely not going to expect him to do anything above and beyond, especially since he's replacing Bruce Dickinson. And simply put, he's not as good as Bruce Dickinson or even as good as Paul Di'Anno. But he's not a bad or awful singer either. I think he's okay, but the instrumental work, the sound palette, and the general mood of this album just lets him down, and that in turn leads to some very tedious and boring moments. I didn't really enjoy many tracks on this album. I didn't dislike them, but all they really had was a nice solo or a riff here and there, but then again, they weren't very memorable. I don't have anything else to say about the X Factor. It's just another really boring and forgettable and weak effort from Iron Maiden.
I went with No Prayer for the Dying. And after releasing many classics throughout the 80s and the 90s, in the 80s, the 90s really began with just utter disappointment for Iron Maiden. Yeah, what am I on about? Iron Maiden in the 90s, not the most prolific band.
Oh, God.
After releasing many metal classics throughout the 80s, the 90s really, began with disappointment for Iron Maiden. As No Prayer for the Dying is, in my opinion, the worst Bruce Dickinson Iron Maiden project, and by quite a bit as well. To me, this album is just what would happen if you took, the heavy metal formula of Maiden's previous records and just filtered out all the interesting progressive ideas and, leave behind just the bottom of the barrel, far too accessible heavy metal pastiche that, oftentimes relies far too heavily on, the catchiness of the tracks. And even in that department, it definitely fails a lot of the time. The lyrics on these tracks are just oftentimes just mind-numbingly dumb and just unmemorable. The instrumentation also just is absolutely sterile. There's really nothing of memorability, of importance about this project. I guess the first half of the album is somewhat serviceable, but then the second half is just an absolute nightmare. And overall, it's definitely one of the least essential albums in their discography, easily the least essential with Bruce on vocals.
Alright, and with that in mind, my favourite tracks from the X Factor are, the one track, Sign of the Cross. My least favourite track is Fortunes of War.
My favorite tracks on No Prayer for the Dying are Holy Smoke and No Prayer for the Dying. My least favorite tracks are The Assassin, Hooks in You, and Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter.
Oh God, Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter fucking sucks. Alright, we're moving on to our number 15 picks, and I chose No Prayer for the Dying.
I chose The X Factor.
The switcheroo. Yeah, No Prayer for the Dying is notoriously the album that marks one of the first major duds in the band's discography. And, you know, when I was going through the band's discography, I actually thought this album was kind of overhated initially. But with more recent listens, I feel like the flaws with the album become more and more apparent, since it just feels like such a letdown after an amazing run of albums, you know, from their debut all the way up to Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. You know, No Prayer for the Dying, in many ways, it just feels like Iron Maiden is doing their thing and sticking to their guns, you know? They're creating some anthemic British heavy metal, but this time it comes off very uninspired and very plain instrumentally and performance-wise, where the album's shine, though, is in the title track, which is a diamond in the rough moment and on the album for me. And Bruce vocally does sound really good still and up to his standard. But the album falls flat in its songwriting and its instrumentation. Also, I just need to know, I think this was the album that saw Adrian Smith leave the band for a little bit. I think he didn't come back until... Yeah, he didn't come back until Brave New World, so he was absent for Iron Maiden's 90s run, which is kind of a blessing on his end.
Yeah.
You know, so the guitar work and the drumming especially is just very uninspired and bland in my opinion. Sure, there's a really sick solo and riff here and there, and there's some cool drum fills here and there, but a lot of it just comes off very average for Iron Maiden. It just seems very unmemorable and very forgettable in contrast with a lot of the band's other material. The songwriting as well is also very unmemorable and kind of forgettable too, since it isn't really all that interesting for Iron Maiden. Like you mentioned, the lyrics, some of them are just completely awful, like some of the worst that Iron Maiden have ever written. And Bruce's charm just doesn't really bring you to the forefront of the lyrics or anything, and when it does, it just sucks. And it sucks really because Bruce is singing his heart out on this album. You know, overall, it has the one great track and a couple of decent tracks here and there, but for the most part, it's easily one of the band's weakest album, and it's truly the first major dud in their discography, and it's easily the worst that they've done with Bruce on vocals. It's not bad, it's not good, it's just meh.
Yeah, I mean, you pointed out the fact that Adrian Smith was absent for most of the 90s, I think explains quite a lot about the gap in quality, and also I think it just signifies how important he is to the band. Everyone always talks about Bruce Dickinson, but I think he's more so the glue that keeps the band together. Anyway,
everyone mentions Bruce, everyone mentions Steve, and even Nico on drums, but you know, obviously Adrian Smith is probably one of the main factors to why Iron Maiden is so good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, anyways, X Factor. This is the second of the two albums that Iron Maiden recorded without Bruce on vocal. Well, not counting their first two, but during the 6-year gap where he left the band. And, you know, while, again, Blaze Bayley is not a bad vocalist by any means, he doesn't come close to the presence that Bruce has on tracks. And I will give Blaze Bayley credit where it's due. I think he does play to his own strengths a bit more on the X Factor than he does on Virtual 11. I think that he does showcase some potential, obviously potential that was never going to be met, but it's not the worst thing I've heard vocally. And the big problem I have is really, it's not that he did anything bad vocally, it's just that he doesn't really fit with Iron Maiden's style. And the rest of the band also just, I don't know, it feels kind of like a forced effort. Just like Virtual 11, it feels a bit like a forced effort. And, you know, while it does have a lot more interesting moments than Virtual 11 does, it still overall just, in the grand scheme of the band's discography, feels just like an album you can skip over, an album that isn't essential in any way. I mean, there's a big Bruce-shaped hole left there, but I still think that, you know, Blaze had some potential, but unfortunately I think the band plays it too safe with him and, you know, tries to phone it in rather than, you know, try something new.
A Bruce-shaped hole sounds like the Radiohead B-sides album to a moon-shaped pool.
Okay, that'll be a good edit.
All right. That would. Alright, so my favourite tracks from No Prayer for the Dying are the title track, Public Enema Number 1 and Mother Russia. The worst track is Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter, which is probably one of the worst Iron Maiden tracks ever.
My favorite tracks on the X Factor are Sign of the Cross, Man on the Edge, and my least favorite track is The Unbeliever. Unbeliever. The Unbeliever. Unbelievable. What am I saying? I almost read it as The Unbelievable. Which
That's awful. What the?
Yeah.
That sounds like you're an anti Justin Bieber fan.
Unbeliever. Unbelievable.
Oh God, kill me now.
Also, quickly, we should probably mention from now on we're limiting best and worst tracks to 3 per category. Yeah, just so half the episode isn't spent on reading out tracks that, in the grand scheme of things, probably just fly over people's heads.
Yeah, true. Okay, so we're moving on to our number 14 picks, and I chose their most recent album, Senjutsu.
I chose The Final Frontier.
Alright, Senjutsu. Their most recent album, and the album that made us push back this podcast for a month or two. And was it worth pushing this podcast back for? Absolutely not, because it couldn't be any less of an unimpressive album for Iron Maiden. You know, not to mention, it's also the band's longest album to date, and in my opinion, it doesn't justify its length at all. The band pretty much stuck to their guns and their usual sound in this album, doing what they do best, but unfortunately, it's not at their best, since I feel like the sound of this album really drags it down. While on the surface the production may seem pretty fine, there's a lot of mixes here, and there's a lot of very muddy and moments on here. Bruce Dickinson's vocals feel a bit buried at times. The guitars just feel kind of recorded, sound like they were recorded through like a really shitty microphone. It's kind of off-putting. And another thing is that I just feel like Bruce vocally, it really isn't on his A game here. He definitely sounds like less impactful and powerful than he has before, and while his operatic style is still very catchy on a few tracks, you can definitely hear age getting to him. Also, I just feel like the band were really dragging this album out. Like, some of these songs are like a whopping 10 minutes long, and some are even longer. And you can't help but feel like the band bloated some of these tracks out with a bit of filler to pad it out, and not really add much interesting dynamically. I do like a few songs here and there, but there isn't really a moment where I'm really blown away, There isn't a single like Bruce Dickinson Iron Maiden album which doesn't have at least one song that I like, but for me, those moments are just few and far in between on Senjutsu, and the album as a whole just feels a little inconsistent. And I don't think it's the worst that they've made with Bruce on vocals. We literally just talked about No Prayer for the Dying. But, for what it's worth, it could have been worse. But alas, it's just an okay effort from them.
I went for The Final Frontier, and because this list is so long, I'm going to keep this brief because, in my opinion, The Final Frontier is probably like the most nondescript album in Maiden's entire discography. I've listened to it 3 times now, and I still really cannot tell you one thing I like about it, one thing I dislike about it. It just feels like, again, Maiden pastiche, and if you want to listen to a sci-fi themed Maiden album, let me tell you something, there's a better one out there. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Okay, so my favorite tracks from Senjutsu are The Writing on the Wall and Days of Future Past. The worst tracks are The Parchment and Death of the Celts.
My favorite tracks on The Final Frontier are The Man Who Would Be King and When the Wild Wind Blows. My least favorite track is Mother of Mercy.
Alright, moving on to our number 13 picks. I chose Fear of the Dark.
I chose Senjutsu.
Yeah. Alright, so, I could just sit here and reiterate some of the same points that I made with No Prayer for the Dying and apply to Fear the Dark, because I really just have the exact same takes for it, in all honesty. The 90s were just a hard time for the band, realistically. Both albums with Bruce were just average Iron Maiden records, and the Blaze era left us some of the worst records to come out of the band's discography, and in general, it was a moment where they just lost the momentum and they weren't able to pick it up until later on. Like, the Bruce records, they just sounded like Iron Maiden albums, but like they didn't have the same drive, passion, and inspiration as the ones of old, and Fear of the Dark is no exception, since it literally peaks at the last track, and every track before it ranges from decent to meh. You know, Bruce still absolutely sings incredibly well on here, and the instrumentals on the surface aren't all that bad and sound like you could pull them from like Power Slave era Iron Maiden. But my god, is it boring and so uninspired. So much so that it's just another hard slog to sit through. The title track for me is really the only reason to even look at this album. But when listening to it, just prepare to be bored, ladies and gentlemen, because it's oh so boring. I have nothing else to say about Fear of the Dark. It's boring, it's uneventful, and while it's not their worst, it's easily one of their most boring albums ever.
Yeah, I went with their most recent project, Senjutsu. And honestly, Iron Maiden releasing their 17th album isn't something that much people were looking forward to with much optimism. I was expecting something serviceable, and that's all I got. Nothing more, nothing less. Senjutsu, for the most part, just feels like, music from a band, sincerely, giving it their all, but just way past their prime. The guitar work is fine, but honestly, it just often kind of blends into the background rather than stand out like it does on the finer Iron Maiden albums. The drumming and bass kind of just do their job, nothing more, nothing less. And Bruce Dickinson has certainly sounded a lot better than he does on Senjutsu. He's still a fantastic vocalist, but this is probably the worst his vocals have ever sounded, in my opinion. Maybe it's the mixing. I don't know. Maybe he just had a cold when he was recording. But overall, it's... also, I mean, I almost forgot to mention another big flaw. The length. It just... when music isn't that exciting, when it doesn't do that much new, an hour this long is just a chore. And a lot of the time, Senjutsu does kind of border on that. I still think the band has, the occasional standout track in them, but for the most part, standout is probably the last term I would use to describe this album. It's fine, it's okay. If you're a hardcore Maiden fan, then get excited because, it's more Maiden, but otherwise, no, it's just fine.
Yeah. Alright, my favourite track from Fear of the Dark is, Fear of the Dark. There's a reason why they still play that live. And my least favourite track is Fear is Key.
My favourite tracks on Senjutsu are Lost in a Lost World, and Darkest Hour. You'd think that when we decided to start a podcast, we'd double check that I'm able to talk first. The least favourite track is The Parchment.
Alright, moving on to our number 12 picks, is it? 12? Yeah, I chose The Final Frontier.
I chose The Book of Souls.
Yeah, The Final Frontier is the album that kicked off the 2010s for Iron Maiden, but generally speaking, I just find it to be one of their more forgettable albums. It's not bad by any means, and it actually has a few really good songs in its first half, but as a whole, I just don't really find it to be that interesting. It's just boring. And it's one of those Iron Maiden albums that really does feel like its length, since there isn't a lot to the songs, and I don't find it as captivating or as memorable in comparison with the band's output in the 80s and the AOTYs, actually, or noughties, is that it? Yeah. Plus, I just feel like the production isn't really doing them any service here, because the sound palette and production of this thing is just kind of bland. Instrumentally and compositionally, I just don't feel all that captivated by the tracks here. Instrumentation is fine, but it's more or less what you'd expect from Iron Maiden, but not at all that enthralling. On the best tracks here, I'm obviously enjoying myself, but that only really happens for like 35 to 40% of the album, since the rest of it is I'm just kind of being left in this state of perpetual boredom. Also, I just don't really get behind a lot of Bruce Dickinson's vocals on The Final Frontier. The man still has range, and he absolutely sings his heart out on this album. But I just can't help but feel like his voice, I feel like his voice isn't aging as gracefully. And, especially when he starts hitting the high notes. And honestly, you were talking about Senjutsu being like kind of the worst album for Bruce Dickinson's vocals, but for me, I think it's The Final Frontier. I genuinely think that. I don't have anything else to say besides that. I just think The Final Frontier is very forgettable. It's easily one of the band's most middle-of-the-road, non-essential records in their discography. And, yeah, it's just meh.
I went with The Book of Souls. Again, I'm going to keep this kind of brief, unlike the album. this album isn't entirely without merit. It's got some great moments, especially the closing track. Oh my god.
Yeah.
But even when it's, not truly great, the material here is largely pretty solid. The band feel like they're putting passion, putting the effort in. The instrumentals are sticky at times. They're, infectious. They're exhilarating. But the material is overall, I think, quite safe. And just like with Senjutsu, I think the length does bring it down a bit. Because if you're going to put aside 90 minutes to listen to an Iron Maiden project, how often are you going to put on Book of Souls? If honestly, I think, the final track could have just been released as a single and I would have been happy enough. The rest of the material is just fine, but in a discography as massive and as deep as Iron Maiden's, it's just, again, very forgettable.
Yeah, my favourite tracks from The Final Frontier are Mother of Mercy, El Dorado, and Coming Home. My least favourite track is Satellite 15, The Final Frontier. The mixing on the intro of that track fucking sucks.
My favourite tracks on the Book of Souls are If Eternity Should Fail and, of course, Empire of the Clouds. My least favourite track is The Man of Sorrows.
Moving on to our number 11 picks, I chose The Book of Souls.
I chose Fear of the Dark.
Hey, we got all of the same albums out of the way. Let's go.
Yeah.
Alright, so The Book of Souls is one of Iron Maiden's most recent albums, and for a while now it was the latest album, but of course, Senjutsu said otherwise. And it was also the album to come out, it was the last album to come out in the 2010s, but to say that the band wanted, wait, hold on, let me say that. And say that the band wanted to, come out with an ambitious album would be an understatement, since at this point in time when it came out, it was the longest Iron Maiden album, clocking in at like an hour and a half's length, of course. Of course, Senjutsu said otherwise, so it's not the longest anymore. And truthfully, I think that this is a decent album from the band. It has its issues, but as a whole, I like a fair amount of what the band had to offer on this thing, and I really dig what the band were looking to achieve compositionally on this album. Well, the tracks are incredibly lengthy and feature some dynamic passages while, still sticking to the core of what makes Iron Maiden Iron Maiden. The band do what they do instrumentally pretty well, and Bruce Dickinson does a really good job vocally in contrast with the album that preceded it. Plus, there's some really great tracks to behold on this album, but, specifically I want to mention the track Empire of the Clouds, the final track, which is honestly one of my favourite post-reunion Iron Maiden tracks, and probably one of my favourite Iron Maiden tracks ever, because I feel like it's one of the band's most creative tracks ever. I love the composition of this 18-minute beast, and I love the additional instrumentation that the band threw in there. It's easily the best track on this album for me, and it's easily the standout track here. Where the album needs a bit of work, in my opinion, is when it comes to the production, realistically. I think most of the tracks are good on this thing, and I think that they are still striving for more, creatively, but I just feel like the production is, at times, a little bit weak. At times, the guitars can feel a bit muddy and a bit buried. There's a lack of punch in some aspects, and on the weaker tracks especially, that's very noticeable, and it holds back some of these tracks from being great. It's a very long album, and I can totally understand why people would find this to be a slog, but despite a little inconsistency, I actually found The Book of Souls to be pretty enjoyable, and a solid and respectable moment for Iron Maiden, considering it's pretty ambitious and creatively fresh, in my opinion.
I went with Fear of the Dark. This is the last project the band would release before Bruce Dickinson would take a 6-year break from Iron Maiden. And for lack of a better word, it's just uninspired. It feels like a band just kind of phoning in the most safe and predictable material they can. While there's definitely certain moments, obviously the title track, but even aside from that, there's definitely good moments on this project. There's definitely a lot of that spark that, was so present in the band's 80s material present on here. It's just, it just doesn't really hold up to any of the band's better material. It feels a little lackluster. It definitely, is better than a lot of their 90s material and also their more recent material, but, as a whole, there's really no reason to go back to this project. If you want to listen to the title track, just listen to the title track. That's pretty much all there is to it. It's fine. It's just as mid as it gets for the band.
Alright, my favourite tracks from the Book of Souls are Empire of the Clouds. Holy fuck, that song is amazing. The Book of Souls and Shadows of the Valley. My least favourite track is The Man of Sorrows.
My favourite tracks on Fear of the Dark are Be Quick or Be Dead, Wasting Love, and Fear of the Dark, of course. And my least favourite tracks are From Here to Eternity and Weekend Warriors.
Alright, we've made it to the top 10. And for my number 10 pick, I chose Dance of Death.
I chose Peace of Mind.
Ah yes, Dance of Death. The one album in the band's discography with the infamously terrible album cover. But, don't let the cover fool you, because all in all, Dance of Death is actually a pretty good album for Iron Maiden, if you ask me. Now, Dance of Death and many other Iron Maiden albums after Brave New World would pretty much remain in the sound that Brave New World set for the band, which was their more progressive brand of their sound. And I can't really complain about that when the quality of some of the tracks on here are just so good, and as just great as some of their peak work. Maybe it's not a consistent album as a whole, and it's not really setting the bar for Iron Maiden albums, but for me, Dance of Death is actually a pretty good effort from the band. The production on Dance of Death is really great in my opinion. I think that the band are showing some great passion and drive through their individual performances. I think the synths are sounding really good on here. The songwriting is pretty strong in a lot of tracks, and some of the band's best modern songs are absolutely on this album. I categorize just Brave New World and Onward as modern Maiden. The riffs and the guitar work still kill. The bass work from Steve Harris is really sticky, and Bruce Dickinson vocally still sounds fantastic and makes these tracks all the more big and anthemic. I don't think there's a bad track on the album or even a mediocre one. All of them are decent at the very least, and despite a handful of forgettable moments, I think that Iron Maiden pulled through with another very good helping of tracks, some of which have grown on me since my initial listen of the album. Dance of Death is just a really good Iron Maiden album. It's the band doing what they do best, and for what it's worth, it's got plenty of outstanding tracks to its name.
I went with Peace of Mind. And I'll mention that from now on, every album on here is good to varying degrees. But, Peace of Mind is certainly good. But when looking at the albums that came before it, and when looking at the albums that would come after it, of course, it really kind of fails to shine in the upper echelon of Maiden's discography. It's got some absolute highlights for sure. I mean, The Trooper, need I say more? But after the big leap forward for the group that was the arrival of Dickinson and, their previous release, The Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind just feels like a little bit of a predictable and underwhelming follow-up. It's not really that different to Number of the Beast. It's just a little less memorable, a little less consistent. It's almost like Number of the Beast, but with a bit of the corners taken off and just smoothed out a little bit, and just it feels a little safer, a little more predictable. And when compared to the grand scheme of Maiden's discography, it's certainly a massive leap when from albums like Virtual 11 or even The Final Frontier. But Maiden have just released so many groundbreaking, just anthemic, incredible albums that this album only really acts like a vessel to serve us The Trooper and then some other tracks.
Right. I'm gonna have to disagree with you there, Chief, but we'll get to that soon. Alright, so my favourite tracks from Dance of Death are Rainmaker, No More Lies, and New Frontier. My least favourite track is Montsegur. I'm hoping I'm saying that right.
My favourite tracks are Where Eagles Dare, The Trooper, and To Tame a Land. My least favourite track is The Quest for Fire.
Alright, moving on to our number 9 picks, and I chose A Matter of Life and Death.
I also chose A Matter of Life and Death.
Yeah. Iron Maiden's 2006 album, A Matter of Life and Death, which for me is another very good album from the band. And at this point, I just find myself so impressed at the fact that the band has gone on to age gracefully past the barren point of their career that is the 90s and continued to strive in making really good and interesting music, since A Matter of Life and Death embraces a somewhat slow-burning yet kind of proggy sound with themes and concept revolving around war and religion. And for what it's worth, it doesn't drag on despite its length, and it has some fantastic songs on display here. Once again, the band sounds great performance-wise in this thing. Compositionally, these tracks are written well and tightly performed. The production is absolutely fantastic too. And the guitar tones on this album sound especially heavy for Iron Maiden, especially on a few cuts here. So on that merit, I would probably call this the heaviest Iron Maiden album. Well, the songwriting and themes on this album are written well, and despite it not being, a full-blown concept album technically, I think that they're pretty concise and potent. Bruce Dickinson does an excellent job at driving these themes forward with his vocal performances, which are just fantastic to say the least, and he again hasn't faltered in his performances yet. He sounds just as good as ever. Now, the guitar work, as per usual, is stellar, the drumming is great, the bass work is sticky, and most of the songs in this album are killer, especially on the final track, which is just fantastic. The only real issue I have with the album is that there's just a couple of tracks that aren't as memorable, but that's fine when, it's got plenty of fantastic tracks to behold. And yeah, much like Dance of Death, A Matter of Life and Death is just Iron Maiden doing what Iron Maiden do best. And for what it's worth, I think it's more consistent than that album, and it has plenty of outstanding tracks.
Yeah, also went for A Matter of Life and Death, which in my opinion is possibly Maiden's most melodic album. There's something almost glam rocky about, the sound and presentation of this album, but the glamour definitely ends there as, this album explores themes of war, of death, of religion. It's not exactly a concept album, but, those themes are very much prevalent throughout and, definitely make the project stand out. It's honestly, I'll be talking a little bit more about Dance of Death and Brave New World soon, and I think the early 2000s Maiden output definitely has a vibe, definitely has a similar atmosphere to it, and it definitely shares a lot of the same pros, a lot of the same cons, and out of those three records, I think the only thing that really separates them is A Matter of Life and Death is probably the least memorable and just the one that I see myself coming back to the least overall.
Right, my favourite tracks from A Matter of Life and Death are The Legacy, Different World, and For the Greater Good of God. My least favourite track is The Reincarnation of Benjamin Brieg.
My favourite tracks are Different World, Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, and The Legacy. My least favourite track is Out of the Shadows.
Okay, we're moving on to our number 8 picks, and I chose Iron Maiden's self-titled debut.
I chose Brave New World.
Ooh, that hurts me. Anyways, Iron Maiden's self-titled debut is a bit of an interesting record in the context of Iron Maiden's discography, as from the get-go, the band definitely sound like the Iron Maiden that we know and love when it comes to the sound and musicianship, but a piece of the puzzle is missing, and, they wouldn't find that piece until a few years later. But even then, Iron Maiden is a fun, punky, and energetic debut album. The first thing you'll notice about the debut is that Bruce Dickinson is not on vocals. He didn't join the band yet, but instead the band initially started with Paul Di'Anno on lead vocals. And while he may not be the powerhouse of a voice that Bruce Dickinson was, Paul Di'Anno does a very good job on the vocal front and helps drive the anthemic and somewhat punky nature of their debut forward. He has some genuine charisma at some points, and I think that he's a solid voice for early Maiden. The musicianship on this album is very tight, and the riffs and virtuosic guitar work on this album is great and very entertaining. And like I said earlier, a lot of the elements that we know and love from Iron Maiden are immediately present on this album. There's some fantastic tracks in this album that still get played in Iron Maiden set lists, and there's a good reason why, because they genuinely kick ass and are just plain fun. And despite it not being one of my favourite Iron Maiden albums, I still really enjoy it. It's a fun album. The only issues that I have with Iron Maiden's debut is with some tracks that aren't really as standout or as charismatic as some of the best songs on here, and the very skeletal and kind of dated production and recording on this album is just kind of a detriment to a few tracks here. I would have liked something that felt a bit bigger, but hey, I won't complain any further when there's some killer tracks on this record, and obviously Iron Maiden would only get better after this point, I would say.
I went with Brave New World, which I will preface by saying an album that I very much like. We're in that stage of the countdown for me. Brave New World was a return to form for Iron Maiden. Not in a sense that it's as good as their best material, but, in a sense that it finally, they got Bruce Dickinson back, and they finally, with him at the helm, were able to capture some of the magic that, made their 80s output just so fantastic. And it ushered in a new era for Iron Maiden, and this album and the two albums that followed it are definitely the highlights of Maiden's career post the 90s, in my opinion. Instrumentally, this album is just absolutely grandiose. It's epic. The guitar work is just anthemic as fuck, and Bruce Dickinson's vocals are fantastic. Especially if you listen to this project immediately after the two Blaze Bayley albums, which I did initially, you immediately notice there's just more cohesion, there's more chemistry. Bruce Dickinson just sounds more natural with Iron Maiden than Blaze ever did. And, this album is definitely a breath of fresh air in a discography that was just slowly very much derailing. And an album from a band that sounds excited and passionate about making music again, unlike whatever they were feeling on Virtual 11 definitely was not passion.
Yeah, my favourite tracks on Iron Maiden are Prowler, Phantom of the Opera, and Iron Maiden. My least favourite track is Running Free.
My favourite tracks on Brave New World are The Wicker Man, Ghost of the Navigator, and Blood Brothers. My least favourite track is The Mercenary.
Okay, from this point on, I think the everything from here on is great. So for my number 7 pick, I chose Killers.
I chose Dance of Death.
The second and final album with Paul Di'Anno as the band's frontman is very similar to their debut, but it feels like, such a massive improvement upon what they tried to do in their debut, and as a result they made what I see as their first great record. When it comes to the production on Killers, I feel like the sound is much more balanced and a lot less skeletal than Iron Maiden, and that in turn allows the songs to have, a bigger punch and a more infectious quality to them. And that's what this album is, simply infectious. The bass mix is definitely a lot more present, and I will always appreciate that, given how incredible Steve Harris's bass work is on Killers. Dave Murray and Adrian Smith's guitar work on this album is, simply fantastic, and there's some incredible solos throughout this album. The grooves in this album, once again, take a lot from punk music, and the drumming from Clive Burr is tight and energetic. Actually, musicianship in general is quite tight and energetic too, if we're being real here, and I really fuck with it. There are some moments of the songwriting that are both grim, but at the same time, they're just fun as fuck, especially for tracks like Killers and Murder in the Rue Morgue, and Paul Di'Anno vocally is very solid throughout this album's duration. There's some fantastic songs in Killers that rank among some of my favourite Iron Maiden tracks. They rank as some of their most fun, and some of my personal favourites, especially like Wrathchild and Killers, come to mind. And while there may be some tracks on here that aren't as engaging or as memorable as some of the best moments here, it's still got plenty of material that slaps, for lack of better words. It seems like a fair amount of people prefer, Iron Maiden more than Killers in some cases, but I honestly think that Killers is a bit of a step up from their debut in many ways, and while it may not be my favourite Iron Maiden album, I still think it's a really fun one.
I went with certainly a bit of an unpopular opinion. I mean, people do like this album, but I wasn't expecting it to end up in the top 7, especially after having to look at that abomination of a cover for the last 2 years and just dreading the moment when I finally had to listen to the piece of music that lay behind it. But lo and behold, it's actually pretty damn good. With a cover as inexcusably hideous as this, I think that the reason it took so long for me to listen to this album was just that I was scared, to be honest. I at that point had only really listened to the band's quote unquote good material, and so I didn't want to ruin my impression of the band with something that looked like this. But behind this abomination of a cover is one of the, in my opinion, the highlight of Iron Maiden's 21st century output. Stylistically and instrumentally, this album certainly follows in the footsteps of Brave New World. But I do think that this album is slightly better overall. I think it's a little more direct, a little more punchy, but also a little more, overall catchier and memorable. I think it's a little more immediate. And overall, it's just an album that I have come back to regularly since hearing it for the first time. An album that I think, sees the band playing with an intensity and a passion they haven't since the 80s. And it's definitely nowhere near the highs of a Maiden's discography. It's nowhere near where they were in the 80s, but, for a band that, let's just say, had a sloppy second half to their career, it's definitely a highlight. It's definitely something that fans of their earlier work can gravitate towards and enjoy. And, don't judge an album by its cover.
Oh boy. Alright, my favourite tracks from Killers are Wrathchild, Killers, and Innocent Exile. My least favourite track is Prodigal Son.
My favourite tracks on Dance of Death are Rainmaker, Face in the Sand, and Age of Innocence. My least favorite track is Journeyman.
Alright, moving on to our number 6 picks. I chose Peace of Mind.
I chose Killers.
Now, at this point, Iron Maiden were just fresh off of Number of the Beast, as Peace of Mind came out the year after, and Peace of Mind may certainly come off like just another Iron Maiden album, but especially when it came after like one of their best albums in Number of the Beast. But honestly, I feel like Peace of Mind is a bit of a transitional and evolution moment, and an evolution from Iron Maiden's sound, and on top of that, I think it's a great album. The only main issue that I have with Peace of Mind is that the last leg of the album kind of halts the momentum of the album. The final track has grown on me a lot since I re-listened to it, but the 2 tracks that preceded it, while fine on their own, aren't as fantastic as the rest of the album, and I feel like the fat that could have been trimmed from this album would make it way better. Outside of that, though, I think that Peace of Mind is a pretty damn great album. Well, the songs on this record maintain pretty much everything that you love to see in an Iron Maiden record. The songs themselves, very anthemic, energetic, and dynamic. The musicianship is incredibly tight and ridiculously good. The production is fantastic. Bruce Dickinson's vocals are fantastic. And there's some incredible tracks on this thing, which are some of the band's most iconic. Like, come on, The Trooper, Die With Your Boots On, Where Eagles Dare. The sheer quality of those songs alone is incredible. Most of this album is just Iron Maiden doing what they do best, and yeah, I will agree, it's very similar to The Number of the Beast, but I'm not going to complain when I'm enjoying it. And, I can't really complain about it when the songs are, fantastic and the instrumentation is still killer, but you can hear the band slowly but surely bringing their sound into newer territories as, tracks like Revelations and To Tame the Land have dashes of progressive elements and passages, sounds that they would end up getting better at over time, but I feel like the progressive sounds that they toy with on here are done well for the most part and, make for some fantastic moments. I suppose I don't have much else to say besides that. I think Peace of Mind is a great record, another fantastic 80s effort from the band, and while it may be a transitional record, it still goes off with some incredible tracks.
I'll keep things brief again with Killers because honestly, I mean, they're both standout albums, but The Killers and their debut are kind of under the same umbrella for me. Stylistically, they're very similar, and of course, there's the 2 albums with Paul Di'Anno on vocal duty rather than Bruce Dickinson, who I will say, the rest of the band is still the same. I know a lot of people like to highlight the fact that Bruce isn't on these projects, but I don't think it's as big of a deal as it was with Blaze Bayley. Obviously, Bruce wasn't even in the equation back then. And, Paul Di'Anno, I think, suits the more punchy, more raw, just more in-your-face sound of this project. It's definitely not as progressive as they would go on to be, but, what it lacks for in, those progressive metal qualities, it definitely makes up for in just intensity and just it's just in your face. It just keeps on giving. And, it's a fantastic album. And I just slightly prefer the one that came before it, which I'll talk about soon.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Peace of Mind are Where Eagles Dare, Die With Your Boots On, and The Trooper. My least favourite track is Sun and Steel.
My favourite tracks on Killers, if my notes will open, Wrathchild, Murders in a Rue Morgue, and Killers. My least favourite track is Prodigal Son.
Alright, we're moving on to the top 5 now. The cream of the crop. And for my number 5 pick, I chose Seventh Son of a Seventh Son.
I chose Iron Maiden.
I mean, what the hell can I even say? This is just another fantastic album from the band, and I really think that this is another really huge milestone in their discography. For me, it's also the one that would finish off what I would consider the quote-unquote golden age of Iron Maiden's discography, since the band weren't truly able to make an album that really stood out as, like a dud or anything like that, because their whole 80s output was just fantastic, to say the least. But Seventh Son of a Seventh Son is a milestone for them, in my opinion, because simply put, it's probably the band's most unique record in their discography, both sonically and conceptually. The band's previous albums before this one, Power Slave and Somewhere in Time, dabble heavily into more progressive territories, the latter of which was more synth-heavy too, but Seventh Son really took the progressive aspects of that music to the furthest depths that they've ever went, in my opinion, as this is far and away Iron Maiden's most progressive, technical, and conceptual release, and the music speaks for itself since it's fucking fantastic. Now, for one, I feel like instrumentally, Iron Maiden are on fire throughout this album. The tight drumming on here is incredibly dynamic. Easily some of the most dynamic drumming in the band's discography is on here. Of course, courtesy of Nico McBrain. Of course, Steve Harris's bass work once again sounds fantastic, and his performances are great. The guitar work is incredibly stellar. The production is fantastic, especially on the more clean portions too. Bruce Dickinson, once again, sounds fantastic in this era. He helps sell the concept of this album, which is a really cool trait this album has in contrast with the others. Since, I think it's cool. It's very fantasy driven, and it revolves around like the myth that the album is named after. It's pretty sick if you ask me, and there's some absolutely amazing songs on this album. Some of which have just grown on me massively since my initial listen of this thing. And I just have to mention that the 10-minute title track here is one of the greatest Iron Maiden songs of all time. I shit you not. My only main gripes with this album is with the last couple of tracks before the final track, which are still enjoyable and don't totally ruin the flow of the album, hence why it's so high in my ranking still. But I just can't help but feel like I've heard these ideas that they've explored on those tracks already and done better. But hey, that's really it. Aside from that, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son is another Maiden masterclass, and I love it.
I went with the band's debut, Iron Maiden. Similarly to Killers, these albums are often just grouped together in like the not Bruce Dickinson category. And while yes, Bruce is one of the greatest frontmen in metal history, I think that his absence on this album isn't a big deal at all. And I think a lot of the material that Iron Maiden would go on to do, while yes, a little more progressive and just exciting overall. God, my throat. I'm in a death metal band on the side. This is the consequence.
You're in a death cover band? No way.
Yeah. No, not Death. Cannibal Corpse, man. Where even was I? I shouldn't go on tangents. I have ADHD.
You're talking about Iron Maiden.
Oh yeah, fuck. Oh, where am I? Oops. Yeah, while the band would go on to create more progressive, just more exciting stuff overall, I still think that, the large core of the band is still there, and, the magic that you see on later Maiden projects, it all started here, and it certainly still is a highlight in the band's discography, in my opinion. I think Paul Di'Anno's vocals are just fantastic. He's a great performer, and, just like with Killers, he suits the more energetic, more punchy style of their early projects. And having him on vocals rather than Bruce also just creates a slightly different dynamic. With just how many classics the band have under their belt, with Bruce on vocals, I think just accept the fact that he's not on everything, and it's not the end all be all, because Iron Maiden is fantastic instrumentally. The boys just kick it into gear from the get go. It's ruthless, it's intense. The band's finer material, while a little more progressive, often fails to capture just the sheer energy and rawness of this project. And even for that reason, it's definitely a must listen in the band's discography. Everything, the drumming is tight, the guitar work is just exhilarating. Vocally, as I said, Paul does a spectacular job. Throughout, it's just a fantastic Maiden album, and it's just a little bit more memorable than Killers, but honestly, even if I was to rate on a fucking, out of 100 scale, they would probably get the same exact rating. They're both equally as good, equally as exhilarating, and equally as exciting.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Seventh Son of a Seventh Son are Moonchild, Infinite Dreams, and Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. My least favourite track is The Prophecy.
My favourite tracks on their debut are Prowler, Phantom of the Opera, and Iron Maiden. My least favourite track is Running Free. Oh my god, I meant to go higher, but not that high.
That voice crack was awful. Holy fuck.
I meant to go Running Free. So, not like that.
Running Free!
Yeah. My throat's fucked today. What's happening? I haven't drinking water.
Take a swig of water, man. Fucking hell.
I've been chugging it, man.
Okay, we're moving on to our number 4 picks now, and for my number 4 pick, I chose Brave New World.
My number 4 pick is The Number of the Beast.
I could imagine that if you were a fan of the band in the 90s and you just straight up didn't like any of the band's 90s output, then you'd be very doubtful that Iron Maiden would, end up making another fantastic album again. But when news broke that Blaze Bayley left the band, Bruce Dickinson came back and they were working on a new album, things were starting to look up for fans all over the world. But then again, amazing comeback albums are very rare for metal bands. But Iron Maiden entering a new era in the 2000s, they defied all odds, and in my opinion, they ended up making one of their best albums ever with Brave New World. For a while now, it just seemed like the same energy, passion, and spirit that we loved the band for was just completely gone, but Brave New World seemed like a kick up the ass for them, since this sounds like the band were inspired instrumentally again, and with Bruce back in the band, we got the good old anthemic Iron Maiden feel that I loved the band for once again. Hell, they even went ahead and started including 3 guitarists now, and for me, the material on Brave New World is just fantastic, for lack of better words. Also, with Adrian Smith coming back to the band too in this new 3 guitar lineup, it's got to be a match made in heaven, and for me, it really is. When it comes to the way it sounds, I think that it's produced excellently. The arrangements and compositions definitely, head for the lengthier side of Iron Maiden's sound, but they work well and remain incredibly engaging for me. Despite how long some of the songs are, and how long the album is in general, it goes by relatively smoothly, and it doesn't drag on one bit for me. Instrumentally, the band sounds fantastic. They feel invigorated again. They feel passionate again. They're like a completely different band, and it shows given the fiery playing from everyone here. The guitar work is amazing. The bass work from Steve Harris is stellar. The drumming is great. Overall, it's incredibly catchy, and I think the variety of what we get here is just great, and it keeps the album interesting for me. Bruce has always sounded fantastic, and he absolutely delivers on the anthemic and uplifting performances, but some of the vocal lines and hooks he sang on this album are easily some of my favourites that he's ever laid to tape. They just feel so classic Iron Maiden to me. They're easily some of the most infectious from any Iron Maiden album, and I love it. The tracks themselves are absolutely fantastic. Some of my favourite Iron Maiden tracks appear on here, like The Wicker Man, the thin line between love and hate, and The Mercenary. It's such a fantastic album and a return to form for the band, and generally speaking, it's at number 4. It's up there as one of my favourite Iron Maiden albums. It gives me the same feelings of some of the band's older material does, and it's one of the best in their discography, in my opinion. I love this album. What more do you want me to say?
Yeah, I went with The Number of the Beast. Iron Maiden's first 2 albums with Paul Di'Anno on vocals were great. But when Bruce Dickinson joined, shit got real. Di'Anno was certainly a good vocalist, as I said, but his style was just nowhere near as operatic as Dickinson's, and I think that kind of limited the band's ability to do more epic and more grandiose things. But with Dickinson's arrival, I think that ushered in an incredible era of Maiden. The rest of the band were finally able to take their music to the unmatched highs that they always wanted, highs that few acts in the metal sphere could ever even hope to replicate. But even aside from Dickinson's amazing vocal performances, the album features the band up to that point at their most tight, at their most intense, most focused. Overall, it's a classic in every sense of the word. It's one of the best metal albums of all time, but it's just a testament to how incredible the band's discography is, particularly in the 80s, that this is so low down my list. But every track on here is absolutely iconic. Every solo is truly memorable. Every moment of this album is just truly exhilarating, and Dickinson definitely allowed the band to explore the higher highs and just explore a more progressive and interesting sound overall. And yeah, it's a brilliant album.
Yeah, my favourite tracks from Brave New World are The Wicker Man, The Thin Line Between Love and Hate, and The Mercenary. My least favourite track is Blood Brothers.
My favourite tracks on The Number of the Beast are The Number of the Beast, Run to the Hills, and Hallowed Be Thy Name. My least favourite track is Gangland.
Okay, we're in the top 3 now, and this is where shit gets real. And for me, my number 3 pick is The Number of the Beast.
My number 3 pick is Seventh Son of a Seventh Son.
The Number of the Beast is the first album in the Iron Maiden discography to feature the legendary Bruce Dickinson on lead vocals, and he sure as fuck makes amazing first impression with The Number of the Beast, since, he just elevated Iron Maiden's sound to like a whole new level of anthemic and incredible. And not to mention, The Number of the Beast is just a fantastic fucking album. Now that Iron Maiden had someone with as much vocal ability and range as Bruce, they were able to take their sound into new heights and to all new levels of epic. The sound of this album is way bigger, it's more anthemic, it's more consistent than their first two albums, and not only that, but it's also consistently amazing. This thing is track after track after banger, and I love the shit out of it so much. It's the only Iron Maiden album that I own on vinyl right now, and it's just incredible to listen to. It's just one of the most like enthralling and just some of the most fun. It's the most fun Iron Maiden album, I would say. Bruce Dickinson's vocals cannot go understated because his operatic vocal range and delivery only adds further to the band's sound here, and definitely makes these songs all the more enthralling. And they're just very memorable and anthemic on top of that. The guy sounds absolutely incredible on this album, and he just gives it his absolute all on here. Of course, some of his best vocals are on here for tracks like Run to the Hills, Invaders, Hallowed Be Thy Name, the title track. It's so good. Not to mention, he drives a lot of the very gritty songwriting forward, especially on, those tracks that I mentioned, which are just really great, in my opinion. Some of the best written tracks that Maiden have ever made. The musicianship on this album is, easily some of the band's tightest, and some of the most absolute killer that they've ever made in their discography. The riffs are incredible, the soloing is incredible, they're all memorable. The music's some of the most catchy and infectious in the band's discography. The drumming is amazing, the bass work is amazing, and it's just such a fun and energetic atmosphere to behold. The songs on here are incredibly memorable, so much so that it's just one of the most memorable albums in their discography. And so much of this is just incredible sounding on so many fronts. To the vocals, to the instrumentation, even to the core songs. Some of my absolute favourite Iron Maiden songs are on this album. It's easily their most replayable, I would say. It has some of their most infectious and catchy work here. And, as an album experience, its consistent energy and anthemic nature and, most of all, just fun energy just makes it one of their most memorable and just one of their most replayable. It stands as one of their best albums, and for me, The Number of the Beast is incredible on so many fronts, and what a fucking way to introduce Bruce Dickinson. Like, holy shit.
I went with Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, and by process of elimination, you may have realized that my top three were all released back to back to back. In what I consider to be the golden era of Iron Maiden, the 80s. An era when they were at their most exciting, most progressive, most iconic. Honestly, this album and the two albums that came before it, are very neck and neck. They share a lot of, similar qualities that make them amazing. But if I had to pick a least favorite, I would have to go for Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. This album is, in my opinion, easily the band's most anthemic. It's the band's only concept album, which, admittedly, the concept is definitely interesting. It's a little hard to follow sometimes when you're just listening to it because the music just kind of takes over. The music itself, while I'm on the topic, is probably the most progressive that Iron Maiden have ever sounded. It's, heavy metal just with epic proportions of just, progressive, song progressions. It's a little bit of a derivative statement. Everything's performed with just a truly marvelous technicality. Dickinson sounds just heavenly. He sounds like some sort of a fucking heavy metal god, which honestly he is. It's just through and through. It's one of the most iconic and just groundbreaking albums in metal history. It's a one-of-a-kind project. It stands out even in their discography. Honestly, it's just the two albums I ranked above it are a little more memorable, I guess. Ones that I come back to a little bit more.
Okay. With that in mind, my favourite tracks from The Number of the Beast are Invaders, The Prisoner, The Number of the Beast, and Run to the Hills. That song, fuck me, dude. And my least favourite tracks, none. I have no least favourite tracks.
My favourite tracks on Seventh Son of a Seventh Son are Infinite Dreams, The Evil That Men Do, and of course Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. My least favorite track is The Prophecy.
We're at the final two albums now, and we both have the same ones.
Yeah.
It's just a question of where they are. And let's answer that now, because my number 2 pick is Power Slave.
Mick. My number 2 pick is Power Slave.
What the no way! You changed it? What the fuck?
Dude, I changed it.
Holy shit, dude. I'm so fucking happy right now. Holy fuck. Oh, dude.
This is the most based episode we've ever made.
It really is. Holy fuck. We are both based as shit now.
I was not expecting that.
Same. Holy fuck.
Honestly, I was not expecting myself to put Power Slave second.
No, dude, you don't understand. Power Slave used to be my favorite. Power Slave used to be my
favorite metal album, period.
Dude, oh shit, man. Fuck. Okay, enough fucking whatever we're doing. Just let's talk about Power Slave. So yeah, Power Slave. Absolute fuckage, the album. Power Slave to me is one of Iron Maiden's most defining and refined albums. It's one of the band's most consistently amazing albums, and it features some of the band's best tracks ever, performance-wise and instrumental-wise. The band pretty much refined everything that they did up to this point to near perfection on this record, as musically and instrumentally, Power Slave is just untouchable. It's just a non-stop adrenaline rush of energy and fury. It's an electrifying listen that's just consistently exciting and incredibly infectious and catchy. The instrumentation on this album is just as fantastic as you'd expect on an Iron Maiden album. The synchronized guitar work is incredible. The riffs and the speeds that the band meet are fantastic, and it has some of the grooviest tracks that the band have ever made, courtesy of Steve Harris, who proves once again why he's one of the best metal bassists of all time here. The guy's just a fucking beast on this album, and that's undeniable. The solos are incredible, the song structure and compositions are fantastic, and the proggier elements of the band's sound are, only becoming more prevalent and much more refined, and that's the case with the final track, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is an incredible prog metal epic that finished the album off perfectly. Bruce Dickinson's vocals are incredible as expected. No surprise there, as he gives it his all, he makes some of these tracks all the more anthemic and all the more grand. Some of his best vocal performances are on this album. There isn't a single moment where he disappoints. I actually do wish that he was, on the instrumental track, Lost for Words, but because of the title, I get it's tongue in cheek, and I can respect that. So, some of my favorite Iron Maiden songs are on this album. The opener, Aces High, is easily the best Iron Maiden opener ever. So many tracks in this album are so catchy that it's unfair, and it's so incredibly consistent. Not a single track is even subpar. It's all amazing, and it's a fantastic fucking listen.
Yeah, Power Slave is incredible, and was for a good while my favourite metal album of all time. And while the album certainly hasn't grown off me one bit, I think just other projects have kind of swooped in to overtake it in recent times. And that includes another project from Iron Maiden themselves. Power Slave took the formula that the band had established on their previous 2 albums, and took it to new, more progressive and more triumphant highs. It was the first project the band, released that really embraced a more progressive metal direction in its compositions and its ideas and its overall sound. A project like Power Slave is a whole lot less immediate than an album like The Number of the Beast. It feels more calculated, it feels more measured with its punches, and the final product overall is definitely more rewarding for it. Instrumentally, this album just holds nothing back. It's absolutely a creative high for the band. The guitar work especially is just simply iconic. Speaking of iconic, Bruce Dickinson just delivers metal anthem after metal anthem after metal anthem on this project. It's a special album. Aces High, 2 Minutes of Midnight, Power Slave, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the amount of just iconic metal classics on this album back to back to back is just mind-blowing. It's honestly near perfect. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. But it's number 2.
Shit. My favorite tracks from Power Slave are Aces High, 2 Minutes to Midnight, Flash of the Blade, Power Slave, and Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. I have no least favorite tracks.
My favorite tracks are Aces High, Power Slave, and Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. Also have no least favorite tracks.
Alright, we're going to move on to our number one pick, the unexpected number one pick, might I add. And that's Somewhere in Time.
Mm-hmm.
Holy shit. We are so based. Holy fuck. Now, I know there'll be a few people here raising their eyebrows at the fact that, we have Somewhere in Time as our number ones for our list, since, a lot of Iron Maiden fans, much prefer the likes of, The Number of the Beast, Power Slave, Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, and some would even go as far as to pick albums like Iron Maiden or Killers. But I just can't bring myself to place this any lower than the top, since I absolutely adore this album to bits, and to be honest, it's one of my favourite metal albums of all time, and in my opinion, it's Iron Maiden's masterpiece. Now, in contrast with the band's previous material up to this point, Somewhere in Time is the first full-on sonic expansion into newer, more daring territories. They've showcased the side of Maiden that has a bit more proggy edges on albums like Peace of Mind and a fair amount of Power Slave, but Iron Maiden decided to lean further into a more progressive metal territory. Since there's tons of incorporations of rhythm and time signature change-ups, the songcraft and compositions are remaining lengthy, but in my opinion more refined. The band even decided to incorporate a more, atmospheric and synthy based guitar sound, I guess. And for me, the band couldn't have pulled it off any better than they did here, because for me, this album is just incredible from front to back. The band still feel like their own selves on this thing, and they adapt incredibly well to these more ambitious sounds. It sounds futuristic as shit, and for me, Iron Maiden just don't hold back on any front. The guitar work on this album is just phenomenal from start to finish. There's so many infectious riffs and solos that I would rank among some of the band's best. I love Steve Harris's bass work on this thing, the drumming is tight, and these songs are just so engaging from start to finish. And I know this word kind of ruined, but Iron Maiden's sound, goes for something epic, I would say. But Somewhere in Time is the most epic Iron Maiden album, in my opinion, in both sound and presentation. The progressive twists suit the band so well, and they only add further upon the band's songcraft and musicianship, and it's just such a huge testament to how talented that the band are as musicians and how Steve Harris is as a composer, Of course, Bruce Dickinson sounds amazing on this album. It's the same old Bruce Dickinson, but his vocals this time around are just so damn breathtaking, especially in this more futuristic and sci-fi setting. His melodies on this are so damn good, and some of my absolute favourite Iron Maiden tracks are on here when it comes to Bruce's vocals. I also really love the lyrics in this album too. I like most of Iron Maiden's lyrics, except for shit like Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. But, I don't know, I just feel like the more sci-fi inspired stuff is great and I love it. And on top of that, I love every single goddamn song on Somewhere in Time. I have very little to complain about when it comes to these tracks. Tracks like Caught Somewhere in Time, Deja Vu, and Alexander the Great are just perfect tracks, some of the most perfect Maiden have ever made. They're some of the most entertaining and just perfect tracks that they've ever made. They're some of my favorites from them, and as a result, I think that Somewhere in Time is an absolute masterpiece and a perfect album. Hell yeah.
Yep, Somewhere in Time, my number one spot, a placement not even I could have predicted. Honestly, Power Slave was going to be a shoe-in for number one, but in preparation for this worst to best, obviously I listened to every Maiden project and I re-listened to the ones I was already familiar with, Somewhere in Time included. And, I already loved this album beforehand. It already was my number two pick prior to, listening to everything else. But it just clicked even more than it already had. Honestly, there isn't a whole lot to separate the quality of this project and Power Slave. And, I really had to listen to each project basically back to back a fair few times before I was comfortable knocking Power Slave down to second place. But, at the end of the day, one of the deciding factors was that every time I was putting on this project rather than Power Slave, I was just marginally, a tiny bit more excited to hear it. This project just connected with me so much. It's amazing. It's a masterpiece. It's one of the greatest achievements in metal history. And it's an album that definitely, gets the respect it deserves from, you know, the metal and the Maiden fan communities. But overall, it really is that good that I think it should be like a metal staple up there with where Powerslave is right now, with albums like Master of Puppets and Rain and Blood. It's just, it does everything so magnificently. It does everything so breathtakingly amazingly. It's just from start to finish the best material that Maiden have ever produced. You know, the sound of the project is definitely similar to the prog metal influences on Powerslave and Summer in Time. But what differs to me here is mostly the atmosphere. I think that this album and Powerslave both definitely are very well represented by their covers. I think Powerslave sounds a little more noble and regal and magnificent, whereas Summer in Time definitely sounds more spacey, more futuristic, definitely, you know, heavily inspired by science fiction. And, you know, those are things that, you know, are often attempted in metal, but a lot of the time well, not a lot of the time, but it's quite easy to make those things, you know, come off as cheesy and kind of predictable and nerdy. But I think that Summer in Time implements, you know, futuristic and science fiction aspects into its sound perfectly. I think it's absolutely incredible. The instrumentation is on par with Powerslave. Honestly, some of the tracks here are just a bit more memorable than anything on Powerslave. You know, I absolutely adore Powerslave, but I just, you know, I cannot ignore that this album is just straight up calling my name. I am blown away every time I listen to this project, and it is my favorite Iron Maiden album.
Yes. My favorite tracks from Summer in Time, well, it's all of them, but some of my absolute favorites: Caught Somewhere in Time, Deja Vu, and Alexander the Great. I have no least favorite tracks. Masterpiece.
My favorite tracks on Summer in Time are Caught Somewhere in Time, Heaven Can Wait, and my favorite Iron Maiden track, AOTY, Wasted Years. I also have no least favorites.
Oh, holy shit, this was so good. This was a great ranking. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we did it. We ranked the entire Iron Maiden discography. That was such a fucking curveball. I'm still in shock. Yeah. Holy shit, man. And yeah, is this the last worst to best of the year, actually?
It is. It is indeed.
Oh, shit. Well...
Oh, but fear not.
Fear not, there will be more, but this is going to conclude the worst to best segment for 2021, and we ended it on a bang, I would say.
Yeah.
And yeah, so thank you guys so much for checking out today's worst to best. We really hope that you enjoyed. What are some of your favorite Iron Maiden albums? What are some of your least favorite albums from them? Please let us know. Be sure to check the links in the description to the Cassette Tapes Discord, the Cassette Tapes Twitter account, and of course links to our previous episodes, and of course to our own YouTube channels and our own Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages. And of course, we have more content coming, don't worry. Just because the worst to best are over, we have a lot of stuff to do. We got more interviews, we got lots more genre essentials, so be on the lookout for those. And yeah, with that in mind, my name's MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
See ya!
Peace and love. Peace and love.
Shut up, Ringo.